Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're here. You found your way to this class, and wanted to remind you that we have a class again on October 25th, and you can always find that sign up on the Pathways to Discipleship page on October. So I hope you'll join us for that one as well. This month, we start a new theme. We are talking about generosity, and through the sermon series and through all the resources on the Pathways to Discipleship website, we'll be looking at ways we can be generous to God, to others, to ourselves, and to the church. And so Pen is with us this morning. He's going to be talking to us and helping us to lean into God's abundance and recognizing that in our own lives. So Pen, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, it's good to see y'all. If you don't know, we started our in-person outdoor worship this morning. So I'm getting a steady fill of FPC members, and it's wonderful. So many times I've been showing up and seeing a few choir and the clergy and Will and calling it a day. So I'm glad to have some connection with you all. I am going to share my screen, and I've got a little PowerPoint that I want to work through. Are you seeing that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. There we go. So, we're in October in worship. We are exploring the theme of generosity, and so you'll start to hear beginning next week. We're going to we've got a 3-week sermon series on being generous toward God and toward one another and with ourselves. And it is if you've been around the church for any length of time, to associate October with stewardship season. But our approach this year is to frame stewardship in terms of what it is to be generous as a way of exercising our discipleship. And so that's the theme for this morning's class. And I wanted to go about our conversation in 2 different ways. One is I want to frame this theme theologically and biblically, and then I've got some questions. Gerald's going to put you into Zoom breakout groups to have kind of smaller group conversation, and then when you Zoom back, and if Gerald will make sure that you know how to do that, but when you Zoom back, I want to talk about some concrete things that are both annual stewardship as a church, and also the capital campaign. You all have probably heard about that, but haven't heard about it recently. So the second half, we'll talk about that, and we can have some Q&A in the chat feature, and that'll be our plan for this morning. If it gets a little close to 10:45, I might start to get a bit itchy, and that's just because I've got to go downstairs and lead worship. But anyway, what I want to say, first of all, in terms of how we approach generosity as followers of Christ, is that I think each of us has a choice that is as simple and as hard as deciding what narrative we believe is true. And the question before us is, do we believe in a narrative of scarcity, which is there on the left, or do we believe in a narrative of abundance? I think at the heart of what it means to understand our world and ourselves and how we are related to God, that's the question that's at the heart of the relationship. Do we believe in a God of scarcity or a God of abundance? Do we believe that there is not enough and that we need to get all that we can? Or do we believe that there is more than enough? And the question then becomes, what can we share? One of those things is true. And And I believe, and I think we all do on our best days, that the narrative of abundance is what is true. And yet we live in a world that keeps trying to convince us that there is not enough and that we must claim what is ours as quickly as we can. So you see this theme shot all the way through Scripture. I'm mindful of Jesus' parable of the man who had a barn and had a bumper crop and tore down that barn and built a bigger barn. That's someone who is committed to the narrative of scarcity. And when I hear that parable, I shudder a little bit because I see myself in that man a lot. I also think that this choice is not just about how do we approach the things that have been entrusted to us, our possessions, our money, our material. I think this is a choice that is deeper than that. It gets at how we understand who God is. And, I think it's the choice between viewing God as the father who welcomes the prodigal home with open arms on the one hand, a God of abundance, versus if you think of another parable that Jesus tells about the talents and the man who buried his talent in a field because he was afraid. He perceived the landowner to be someone who is exacting and demanding and scarce. I think sometimes if that's your view of God, that's the God that you experience. And so I think this is a really, really important choice for disciples of Christ to make. And I think if we can live by the narrative of abundance, it changes everything about how we go about in the world, about how we exercise our faith, about what we do with our resources. So that's the kind of central choice before us. But the question is, so how do you make that practical? What does that look like when it's lived? One of the best books that I've read on stewardship or on a Christian's approach to the stuff that we own is a book by Adam Hamilton, who's a pastor, Methodist minister in Kansas City. And the book is called Enough. If you have not read that, I highly recommend it. And if you don't want to read it, I'll tell you what it says in about 30 seconds. So essentially what Hamilton does in his argument for how to teach disciples of Christ to live by this narrative of abundance as opposed to scarcity. He kind of maps out a pathway that gets us to being generous with the things that we have. And what he sees is, you start with gratitude. It is approaching, it is taking stock of the things that are in your lives, whether they're material, whether they're relationships, whether they're experiences, and having and trying to practice gratitude first. He believes if you can do that, that can lead you into a feeling of contentment, that gratitude leads to being contented. And then he believes the next step is when we are content with what we have and who we are, that can lead us into a life of greater simplicity, where our anxiety to be more or do more isn't leading us to take more, but it's actually, if we're content with who we are, then we are able to let go of some of the things that we hold on to that make our lives more complicated. And that is what, so Hamilton thinks to get to generosity, to being truly generous, we get there by practicing a more simple life. And so the way he talks about this in the book is, you start by kind of inventorying what you're spending money on, and when you can strip some of those things away, make that lifestyle more simple, that can lead you into a greater generosity. And then his final argument is that when we are generous, that is really when we experience joy, and not just our own joy, but that is where Hamilton argues where God takes joy in seeing how we relate to one another and to God and to our neighbors. And so I think that's a really practical and clear and helpful way to articulate how we approach generosity. So a lot of this rings true to me. But I want to think biblically about what it is to be generous. And I'm going to read a very familiar story. This is from John's Gospel. It is the feeding of the 5,000. You've heard this before, but what I want you to do, I'm going to read it in a minute. And what I want you to do is, I don't want you to concentrate on the miracle itself. And I don't want you to concentrate on how Jesus is testing the disciples. And I don't want you to concentrate on how the disciples kind of fail to get it, because that's kind of always what the disciples do. What I want you to focus on, and as I read this, I want you to try to empathize with and kind of have an emotional, put yourself in his shoes. Put yourself in the shoes of the little boy that's in this story. Okay? So I'm going to read from John's Gospel. If I can make the faces disappear so I can see the screen. There we go. This is John's Gospel in the 6th chapter, beginning at verse 1. Again, think about this story from the perspective of the little boy. After Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, and so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." So when I identify with the little boy who was in that crowd, it helps me to see the kind of joy that can come when we don't approach things as if we know how to solve the problem, but we share what we have. We are generous with what we have. That the boy had 5 loaves and 2 fish. He shared all that he had. And then the joy that little boy must have seen and felt as he watched Jesus take what he could offer out of his generosity and then do with it that much more. I think that is that feeling of watching God use the ways that we are generous to multiply that blessing for use for God's vision and God's kingdom. I think that is the deepest joy that comes from giving and from practicing our generosity. And so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to send you into your Zoom breakouts. and Gerald's going to make that magic happen. And what I want you to do is, if you, I think a lot of you know each other, but if you don't, just kind of, introduce yourselves and spend about 15 minutes. Gerald will call, you'll see a little clock when it's time to come back, and then it'll zoom you back in. But spend about 15 minutes. I want you to really think about a person that you know personally who is generous. And I want you to share what you notice about them beyond their generosity. Share who it is, and then share something else about their character, about how they live their life. I want you to explore in your own lives, your own practice of generosity. If you've ever had a 5 loaves and 2 fishes experience, and that God used something that you gave to multiply to a greater purpose. And then, since you know each other well by now, I want you to think about and share in what ways that God has been generous with you. Again, that gets us back to that gratitude part that I think is at the root of how we get to generosity. Well, if I had all the time in the world and I didn't have to do church in 24 minutes, I'd love to hear what y'all talked about, but I'm not going to do that, because I want to talk about, we've talked kind of theologically and biblically about generosity, and I want to take that concept and think concretely about our church and about stewardship, and also about the capital campaign. So again, what I'm hoping to get across is that there is a very important formative practice of discipleship in being generous with toward your neighbors, toward your family, but also toward the church. And I see faces on this call, and I know that you are, and I appreciate that. So trusting God with what you have as we share our resources with the church. Let me say a word about stewardship for next year. This is a different stewardship year than normal. But what I want to say too is that I think, and I really believe this, the importance of our mission and ministry next year is critical. And in the midst of so much uncertainty and change and a pronounced understanding of inequality that we see around the city, the need that people have for a worshiping community, the need that people have to connect with one another, I think our mission and ministry next year is just really, really critical. And so I want to briefly say that some of the things we have in mind for next year are we have a focused area of outreach. The outreach committee with the session have really zeroed in. We've got a 4-year plan to implement a gradual increasing focus in a couple of areas. One is in a particular zip code. 28208 is essentially the neighborhood where Westerly Hills and Lakewood Preschool are. That's going to be an increasing focus for us and for the outreach committee as they try to focus our funding, the resources the congregation shares with us. And so you're going to begin to see more of a focus on that next year. There's also an emphasis on a multi-generational approach as we try to help our neighbors there. We've had a historic commitment to children in the church that goes back all the way to the beginning of the Child Development Center. And what we know through research is that it's important to support children as well as their parents, a kind of multi-generational approach to outreach and mission. So that's going to be an area of focus next year. There's another layer on top of that that's related to the capital campaign that I'll get to in a minute. We are increasing our commitment to children, youth, and also, again, viewing their families as an important part of that ministry. Natalie Ragor's position, if you don't know, has been changed to be the executive director of children, youth, and their families. So we're trying to minister to the collective instead of doing just programs for kids. Worship is critically important, obviously, as well as fellowship and care. So that's kind of some of the focus areas that we have, the priorities we have in 2021. Gail Merkinson's on this call, and she didn't sign up to be the stewardship chair during COVID, but she got that lucky task. And one of the things the stewardship committee has been doing is really since June has been trying to take the temperature of how COVID is impacting our members and our finances. And so we have actually been in a stewardship season as we think about next year, starting in the summer. And what we found is that we have 170 pledges, $1.6 million committed so far. We are in the process of setting what we believe to be a realistic goal that's going to inform our budgeting for next year. But what we found to date is that the congregation is generous, which is no surprise to me. There is a slight increase if we compare those 170 people from 2020 to 2021. There's a slight increase in their pledges, and so that's really good news. We are getting ready very soon to send out a letter and a pledge card to the whole congregation. And again, we're going to focus on this theme of generosity in October, and are going to have the first ever virtual commitment Sunday on the 25th of October of this year. So that's a word about stewardship. I'm going to move on to the capital campaign and leave a little bit of time for questions. And for the capital campaign, just a reminder that we have our Opening Doors capital campaign that the session approved that will help us pursue 4 priorities that will help us live into our mission. And these grew out of our 2017 strategic plan. And so the first priority, not the first priority, but a priority is to renovate and enhance our home for worship. That includes the sanctuary. It includes the organ. It includes a welcome center where the library currently is, as well as some long needed building maintenance. And secondly, expand our local mission and outreach for children. And particularly here, we're talking about expanding the Child Development Center that's in our church and offering scholarship so that kids that could not afford to come here can. That's a benefit to those kids. It's also a benefit to us and to our community. And so that's a major area of emphasis for the capital campaign. We are going to provide a mental health services in the center of the city, a counseling center, a partnership that we will have with Presbyterian Psychological Services. Again, that's a need that the city has that our church feels called to address. And then support global mission for our neighbors. We have partnerships in Cuba and Mexico and Russia and Haiti. And so we were humming along with the capital campaign. We began early fundraising. We have had pledges to date of over $8 million, which is fantastic. When COVID hit in March, we, out of sensitivity to our members, we stopped our active solicitation of gifts. We were kind of expanding the circle of those we were approaching for the campaign. What I want to say to you is that the session remains very committed to the project. We anticipate resuming fundraising at the beginning of 2021. And we have plans that are in motion for construction to begin in the sanctuary in mid-June of next summer. So we extended that timeline in March when COVID hit, but that's the timeline that we continue to plan for, and we expect that we will hit that. And it's slightly unfortunate that probably about the time we're back in the sanctuary, we'll have to move out And a lot of people have said, well, why can't we work on the sanctuary while we're out already? There's a lot of permitting that has to be done. So that's why we haven't just jumped in with both feet. I also want to share that we'll likely begin to employ some of the funds that have been collected so far for the outreach components to the campaign. We're not going to wait until next June to begin to use the money that members have given us and will give us in the spring for the sake of our outreach components to the campaign. So let me share one more thing. I want to share the latest rendering of the sanctuary with you. And then I'm going to actually, Robert, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I'm going to actually let Robert answer questions that you have because I've got to get my robe on. But can y'all see that?
Mm-hmm.
This is the latest rendering of the sanctuary, the chancel, that Jenkins Peer has developed along with a work group from the Capital Campaign and a liturgical architect whose name is Terry Eason. If you've seen the earlier rendering, you will notice that the floor in the chancel is much, it's not white. We initially had it a kind of white marble. This is much more in keeping with the tones of the room. And you see it expands the choir loft, the chancel area for the choir. It helps with a lot of other things in terms of flexibility, built-in space on the stairs for children's choirs, continues to have the central pulpit as a feature. You see the new organ console and casing behind the choir. There's one more kind of side view. So this is again looking from what was Amen Corner into the sanctuary. What I want you to see that's I think going to be pretty transformative is if you look up into the ceiling, you can see it is lit. We've had a lighting consultant that has helped us still have lights that will work for television, but also lights that'll bring our sanctuary into this century in terms of how we treat the room as well as the ceiling, and it'll really warm the room up a lot when it's all said and done. So I'm going to these, by the way, these aren't a secret. We're going to share these renderings with the congregation in a communication soon. But I'm going to now turn it over to Robert to do some Q&A. And if you would use the chat feature, you can ask a question. It's been great to see you all. And let's see, let me stop sharing. And I hope to see you Sunday morning at 9 o'clock sometime for outdoor worship, if not before. Bye-bye.